Thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name's Taylor Hollybar, and I'm one of the APS strategic leaders. And I've had the good luck of getting to work with a number of institutions who've been sort of involved early in the process of rolling out CPO. And so I'm excited to get to talk to you today about some of the thinking that we've been doing, some of the lessons that we've learned about effectively communicating and rolling out CPO on campus. Just a few slides up front with some housekeeping items. We do like to encourage folks to update your name and add your institution by adding your institution. So if you have the participants menu by clicking at participants in the little Zoom bar, you can just click rename and add your institution name at the end of your name. It's always fun to get to know where people are actually from. And then, of course, everyone's Zoom Pro by now, but make sure that you are aware of your status with regards to your video and your audio. I'll ask folks just to stay off video and off audio in the main session together, unless you specifically want to interrupt me to ask a question. And then in the breakout sessions that we'll get to in a little while, please do feel free to turn on your video at that point in the smaller groups. It's always fun to see facial expressions and all that jazz. And then, as I said, yeah, please do feel free to interrupt me with questions, either by unmuting yourself and shouting me down in the main session, or by using that chat function or using the icons to send signals to me. I've got a couple colleagues on the line today who will help me monitor the chat. So if I'm missing something, they'll flag me down. So don't hesitate to use that and be persistent if you need to get an answer. All right, so that's our housekeeping slides. Today, of course, we're going to talk about course planning optimization. We'll do a little sort of orientation and level settings so we're all on the same page. We'll go through some of the guidance that my colleagues and I have prepared around sort of some frameworks for thinking about how to talk about and train on CPO. And then I'm very excited to have my colleague Karen Stone from Southern Oregon joining on the line, and she and I will chat about what we've been doing at Southern Oregon. And then we'll let you guys talk amongst yourselves about your thoughts on what we've been sharing. We'll come back together, do some Q&A, and talk about some next steps. But before I go into my spiel, we have a quick poll here that my colleague Faye will launch for us. So the question is, where are you in the process of rolling out CPO on campus? Have you begun rolling it out to broader users such as department chairs, or are you still in the planning pre-rollout phase? And there's no desired response here other than the truth. So we've got about half of folks having voted. Now we're up to 75%. So I'll give folks maybe 15 more seconds and we can close polling. Oh, I think we've got everyone because the remainders are EAB people. So majority of people have not rolled out CPO yet, which is great. We'll give you hopefully some guidance on things to be thinking about as you get ready to do so. If you have begun rolling CPO out to users, please don't hesitate to chime in with your own experiences and perspectives. We will be glad for your wisdom and your experience as well. So I'll just close that poll. So as I said, let's do a brief bit of level setting here. Course planning optimization is the newest module in the APS platform. So our goal is to help you proactively create the right set of course offerings for your students through things like a user-friendly interface, which is hopefully pulling together data that previously was pretty disparate and spread across campus into a single centralized place. That historical data is complemented by a forecasting model that lets you think about the future and think about where shifts in demand might be happening. And then finally, we also, for the first time in APS, have a part of the platform that's refreshing on a daily basis so that you're able, hopefully, to make timely adjustments to course offering during the process of registration. So to make that a little bit more real, I'm going to walk through just one part of the CPO platform and try to call out some things that I think are relevant for thinking about the context of communicating and rolling out CPO on campus. Please feel free to follow along with me in your own platform. The usual instructions for logging in apply. So if you don't use SSO, you can go to reports.eabanalytics.com. And then the one sort of nuance here that I'll note is that depending on whether CPO has been rolled out in the live production site or is still just sitting in your staging site, you'll either need to follow step 1 for folks who have it just in staging, or you will not need to follow step 1. So step 1 is choosing the appropriate project, either the live production site or the staging site, by clicking the caret next to your institution's name. And then once you've got to the right site, you can click the caret next to the dashboard name, which might be APS Home or APS Analytics, and choosing course planning optimization. So now I want to give you sort of some frameworks that we've thought about at EAB for talking about how we might roll out or communicate about CPO. Go ahead and click in. So one thing that we want folks to be thinking about is what's your elevator pitch for why you're asking folks to be trained on or to get familiar with CPO. So we've got sort of 3 guidelines here. So first, some context, what is CPO? And then more specifically for your institution, why is it a priority? So here, for example, we've given some description of what CPO is, and then sort of imagining for a particular institution, we've said, in the past at our institution, we've had low and high demand courses that we hadn't anticipated, and those cost precious instructional resources, and they also harm student progress. So that's why we're asking you to pay attention to this at this point. Then we want to think about what are the relevant strengths of CPO vis-a-vis that priority. So what is it that you think about that CPO will help you resolve with regards to common challenges on campus? So here are some possible answers. You might say that CPO is going to alleviate the strain of course planning. You might say it helps optimize instructional resource use. It might help ensure that you're matching offerings to demand. Or you might say that because you have that daily refresh of data, you'll be able to make changes to course offerings farther in advance rather than scrambling to do everything once students are actually on campus in the fall and getting ready to take courses. So again, you might have a different relevant strength of CPO or benefit of CPO that you want to call out for your institution, but that's a conversation we want to encourage you to have amongst yourselves on campus, and then also with your strategic leader as helpful. And then finally, we want to think about, so what does this mean practically? What are the expectations around how CPO will be used, and what's in it for me, for users? So for example, we might say, deans and department chairs will be required to use CPO for course planning, and we believe this will not be another thing on your list, but it will help you, get through your list of to-dos by providing information at the ready and allow you to make proactive and not reactive decisions. So again, what this looks like on your campus will be a little bit different probably from what we've suggested here, but I think that combination of your institution's context along with why CPO and how it benefits users are the elements that we want to make sure that folks are being able to draw out. Then we want to think about developing a training plan for CPO. This may be a conversation that you're already having on campus around rolling out APS in general, but we particularly want to draw this out in the context of CPO here. So we've got, going back to the tried and true 5 W's and an H. So who, what, when are our first 3 W's. So who is going to deliver and coordinate the trainings, and then who should actually be trained? This is an area where, depending on how you do scheduling and how you do course planning on campus, you might adjust things a little bit. At some institutions, there may be sort of professional schedulers who should be drawn in, and those are folks who probably haven't been exposed to APS in the past, so they might need a little bit more context on what APS is, how it's usually used, and what they're being asked to do with it. Then, in addition to who, I want to think about what. So you saw that in my little demo, I looked only at the registration status tab. You might do that. You might also try to cover the other two tabs as well, so course planning and the course analysis tabs, which are designed to be used not necessarily during an ongoing registration period, but in advance of registration when you're actually putting together your list of course offerings. So thinking about what set of content you want to cover, and then also whether and how you want to connect it with other information that folks may already be familiar with in the APS analytics dashboard, sort of that historical, vanilla, original APS data. So the trade-offs that we're thinking about are providing people with enough information to accomplish the tasks that they need to accomplish without giving them so much that they're completely overwhelmed and that you can't get through all the content that you want to get through. And then when? So our advice here is that we want to think about training on CPO not too soon, so that folks aren't forgetting what they were taught when they're actually in the process of doing things like monitoring registration or developing a course schedule. But we also want to have enough time in advance of those processes so that we can sort of kick the tires a little bit, work out any kinks, and identify areas where processes might need to be tweaked a little bit, or additional clarification, additional training might need to be offered. So that's a conversation that clearly needs to happen campus by campus, and your strategic leader will be more than happy to sort of think through the trade-offs about how this will fit into being in that Goldilocks zone of timing vis-a-vis the process that you are looking to address. On to our next two W's and an H. This is the where is particularly a live issue now. And I'll come back to this when I bring in Karen Stone from SOU, but we've done our trainings virtually. We're definitely having ongoing conversations about as summer comes and vaccines start getting rolled out to college professors in Oregon, at what point do we want to shift to in-person, and what are the pros and cons of being in-person versus virtual for this kind of training? And then finally, thinking about how we, finally for the W's, think about how we want to message the why for people coming into these trainings. I know virtually every institution I work with, one of the concerns is that chairs, deans, maybe even schedulers are being asked to learn and use a million different systems. So we want to make sure that we're emphasizing in communication about the training that this is actually worthwhile for users, and why it's worthwhile for users. And if and I'm just making that sure that's front and center in those conversations. Finally, what is the modality of the training? What's sort of the format of the training? So how are we training folks? Are we doing it in large groups? Are we doing it individually? What's the mix of synchronous live training together versus asynchronous, either preparatory material in advance of the session, and then also sort of asynchronous practice sessions after the session? So what are the mix of strategies that we'll use to get people comfortable using CPO? So that's the framework that I wanted to offer as you talk to your strategic leader and your colleagues on campus about rolling out CPO. I'm excited now to make that a little bit more real by introducing my colleague, Karen Stone. Karen is the AVP for Academic Resource Management and Professor of Biology at beautiful Southern Oregon University down in Ashland, Oregon. So Karen, go ahead and pull yourself on camera if you're ready. I have my Brady Bunch windows set to the side so I can't tell. Yes, please feel free to interrupt me as I go through this. I'm going to offer a few comments on how Karen and importantly her colleague Chris Stanek, who is the director of IR at SOU, how Chris and Karen and I have been going about rolling out CPO at SOU. So here's sort of a high-level summary of our actions. And SOU actually is relatively new to APS. We just finished implementation in December. And so CPO has been sort of the first specific component of APS that we've rolled out, which I think has had pros and cons. But we began by pulling together a group of individuals beyond Karen and Chris who are excited about data and using data to lead on campus. So we have two what SAU calls directors, other institutions would call them deans, and then one chair. So a mix of unit levels and perspectives from that regard. Back in December, we did sort of initial preview orientation to CPO to get folks used to the idea that this tool would be coming. Then this calendar year, Karen put together some lovely supplemental resources that we used to take CPO and make it specific to SOU. And I'll show those in just a second. I also put together an orientation video, nothing fancy, just recorded it on Zoom, that we invited attendees in our trainings to look at beforehand, with the goal of making sure that folks, A, could log into the platform, and B, knew a little bit about what APS was and what they'd be getting into, so that we didn't have to spend quite so much time on the upfronts in our time together actually going through CPO. We've structured our trainings at SOU, or we've intended to structure our trainings at SOU in a college by college or division by division, to use SOU's nomenclature, fashion. And my push for adopting that approach was, especially with virtual sessions, I think it's helpful to have people who, A, know each other and are used to talking about unit management conversations together. When they have that experience or that muscle memory of talking about their work in that group, my hope at least is that folks are more able, more comfortable talking through challenges that they've had, more comfortable thinking about how this tool will fit into its processes. And then after holding our first training session, we pulled back up with that overall leadership group to talk about what went well, what hadn't worked quite so well, and to think about changes to our approach going forward. I'm just going to pop forward one slide to comment on this, and then I'll ask Karen to chat with me about what we did. So one of the things that I think was especially effective in SAU's approach was creating sort of a handout for folks going through the training, both with sort of step-by-step illustrations of what to click, where to look, with examples that were initially specific for the group that we were working with, and then also provided strategies. You'll see this down here. Strategies for handling specific situations at SOU. So if a section or a course isn't filling, then here are some strategies that you can use, and here's what that would look like in our local context. So I particularly like that, Karen called out they do use Navigate, so she called out that tool. She's using the nomenclature of term by term, T by T, so because that's the way that chairs talk about it. And then also using information in course planning. So I saw that there were a few chat questions. I'll pull those up. Yes, yep, great. Karen, what would you say about how we thought about this, what worked, what's sort of your introductory reactions to how things have gone at SOU with this process?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Taylor. I think we struggled with what level to hit. We didn't want chairs or program managers to be overwhelmed by the plethora of data that's in CPO. We wanted to be able to focus them, but we also know that they need to have kind of an overall outline of the content. So we're trying to balance, okay, give them a little bit of an overall, but let's drill in and look at really specific examples that they would be dealing with in their day-to-day management. Specifically, again, this is related to CPO, but we're also rolling out APS, the analytics side of APS. So in CPO, we chose, let's look at management of registrations. What's low enrolled and what's over enrolled, and how should we shift the faculty? So really specific examples, And then okay, well, what's next? And we felt that that was really important to have that conversation. Now you have data, but what do you do with it? What kind of decisions do the data help inform? So I think what we learned was a bit about that level, where to hit. And maybe we didn't hit it perfect on the first try, and second try we'll do better. I think what we also learned, and this won't come as a surprise to anybody, was to make sure that you have time where your students in the class, whoever you're training, has the time to click themselves, click in the platform, a little bit of time to explore. And you're sitting there waiting to help them as they explore themselves. I think that's more difficult in a virtual world rather than just running a workshop and being in the same room with them. We tried to balance the amount of time the training session was. We tried to keep it to an hour, but then that hour didn't really allow us to hit all the points that we felt we needed to hit, and also allow them the time to get in and explore themselves. So that was our next step, was in the when that Taylor just pulled up was, 90 minutes probably would have been better. So there's some initials thoughts. I'm sure more will come up, but I would love to hear any questions that people might have.
Yeah, and as folks are formulating questions, at least two things that I thought were relevant, or three things. We can come with three things. So one, Karen and I and Chris, and then the actual division director who actually led the first training, part of our leadership team. So he'd been in the conversations about training. We spent 2-hour-long sessions in prep for this first training, going through and choosing specific examples, writing down course codes that at that point in registration were under-enrolled, over-enrolled, so that we could specifically go through and sort of say, here's an example of a course that stands out to us, which I think it made us feel more comfortable with the training. It was what we realized after was that it was not sustainable or scalable to spend that much time for every training session and customize it for each session. And then registration, it's live, near live data, and so there was no sort of guarantee that by the time we got to the training, after doing our prep, that example would still stand. So I don't think we have a solution to that. If you're the kind of person who needs that kind of planning, maybe it's needing to check those examples sort of day of the training session. But of course, that's an investment. The other, I've lost my middle thing, but the last thing was, we tried to make the session, we tried to encourage sort of hands-on clicking, follow along. As I mentioned, we sent that preview video, which included instructions for logging in, and this is the eternal experience of the APS strategic leader. There's still someone who hadn't logged in and who messaged me during the session and said, my log is not working. So that's not to say that the prep wasn't worthwhile, but I think we're still, working through ways of the right way of setting up that space, setting that expectation that people actually be in the platform. And, it's especially hard when you're not in the classroom together, not in the lab room together, and just having to rely on people doing it on their own at home. Maureen, I saw that you had raised your hand. Go ahead and take yourself.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. And some of it has to do with the beginning. I was kind of looking around at the time. But so my question is, going back to the spreadsheet earlier with the courses and thinking of who's looking at them, is there a way to bring, such in general education, is there a way for us to bring humanities and to look at those 100, 200 level as a grouping? And I bring it forward now because it would affect how we think of I'm thinking of training with faculty, if that's role. So sometimes we look at courses, but maybe there are other options for students to take besides that one course. And we can get, right now we get zeroed in on that one course. And when we step back, we realize, well, they could take one of these other 10.
One of the thoughts that we had initially was that it'd be really cool if we could have someone that the chairs recognize, some of the chairs we're used to working with, i.e. their division director, lead the session. I think it was fair to say that we decided that was an unfair expectation for a division director. And initially it only worked because that division director had only been part of the leadership team, and so in these conversations, in any case. Karen, I don't know what your current thinking is on who should lead trainings initially, how you're thinking about how we're going to evolve that as we go forward.
Yeah, there have been discussions, of course, about the train the trainer kind of model, and the trainer has to be facile with all the different levels. When there are a lot of pauses, when there's a lot of head scratching, some of that's okay because then it does show the pupils, the students in the class, that you're struggling too. But of course, that's not exactly what you want the major meaning to come across as. So I think that we're looking at Chris, as Taylor mentioned, is our IR director. Chris and I have been working on, getting all the data into APS and CPO. We're very familiar with the choices that we've made and why we've made those choices. We're much more familiar with, the platform, the choices, the pull downs, what those mean. We're much more we're a banner school. We're familiar with the banner codes, those kinds of things. And so we've turned to, rather than having a dean or division director being the trainer, back to myself or Chris being that, just because of our familiarity with it. As Taylor mentioned, we could beg, borrow, and steal Taylor for some of the trainings, but he doesn't know the ins and outs of, oh, well, yeah, I know that psych class, of course, it's low enrolled this year and it's not compared. That's the one we had to switch because the person's on sabbatical. We know all those ins and outs of the data. So picking that appropriate level is important and worth the consideration of all the different angles, I think.
Yeah, and one of the things that we sort of have lightly discussed with SOU is there someone, does it make sense to bring on a full-time trainer of some kind? Because it's hard to have an AVP and a unit director take on that much responsibility. It's a good chunk of time. But I think, as you just said, Karen, there's the familiarity with, there's so many different things to be familiar with, both SAU's processes, SAU's courses, SAU's data, the way the platform has been configured, in addition to the way the platform works, that squaring that circle is tricky because it's just a particular knowledge set. I think the move that we've made to doing sort of a joint-led training, if you're an old-time APS partner, you maybe remember that when strategic leaders used to come to campus, typically the strategic leader would stand up in front of the room and lead the session, and maybe we were introduced by the provost or associate provost or something like that, and then that person would stay in the room and answer questions. But it was really led by the SL. I think there's a lot of benefit to having someone from the institution, be at least a co-trainer or a co-leader. But of course, the trade-off is the amount of time and investment that it takes for someone to develop that level of expertise and then just actually execute on the training.
I hope that when the chairs are in there and really comfortable with the platform using it, that they then train the new chair, that they provide a support system for themselves But certainly we're far from that. We've got to get a certain level of proficiency before we see those kinds of interactions, I think.
Yeah. What are other folks thinking about in the context of your own institutions? What are pitfalls that you're potentially anticipating, or exciting opportunities as you think about developing a training approach?
I'll mention one question that's come up just while people are formulating their own questions, and it was related to stipends and whether to, pay people to encourage them to come to trainings, or just to value their time. And with summer coming up, that might be a pretty prime opportunity if your chairs aren't working, if they're not on contract during the summer, or if they have a limited contract for the summer. You may want to consider some sort of special training session for a stipend to bring them in. We've found that has allowed us to have some focus on an area. We're not competing with all the other daily student complaints, scheduling issues, we're in budget season, all of those kinds of things. So summer might be a nice time to set up a training session.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just going to say, one of the sort of it should have been expected, but it wasn't necessarily issues that we've run into at SOU is just the reality that, we did this first training session at the end of February. And then we started thinking about when we were going to schedule the next session, and, discovered pretty quickly that spring break is the end of this month. And there are other things going on the 2 weeks before spring break. And so finding time to fit in trainings, even sort of a month out, became pretty quickly a challenging proposition. And so that's led us to think about, well, do we need to, how can we squeeze this in a more sort of flexible, kind of optional kind of way right now? And then maybe come back to the idea of doing sort of mandatory or more universal trainings over the summer or sometime. So that goes back to that tricky issue of getting the training, just in time, but not too late and not too early, because people forget and then people get really busy. Let's go ahead and go into breakout groups. So we're going to have people go into breakout groups and go through the worksheets that my colleague Katerina will put in the chat now, if she hasn't already. So the assignment is to go through the worksheets, chat through each row for as long or as little time as each one seems like it warrants. We'll come back together in, let's say, 20 minutes. So that'll be about, for me, 11:10, for people on the East Coast, 2:10. And we'll ask someone in each group to be responsible for sharing back to the larger group what you discussed. So how do you actually add a section, or how do you cancel a section, or how do you hire an adjunct? Because we want folks to think about, okay, so what do I actually do with this information? And being able to say, all right, so you would go into Banner and do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you're not doing it in detail, but having that, painting that picture, I think can be valuable.
Yeah, and we found out that we just don't have any. It's not surprising, because this is true often when we dig into any problem. We just don't have any standardized practices that way. And so the more that we look at the registration stuff, it starts to spill out into other areas beyond scheduling. I think is part of the reason it's so complex. Opening a section then requires hiring an adjunct. than all of us, or doing an overload or something like that, then we're looking at those policies and realizing, oh, that's different across sections too, across colleges rather. So it becomes like, oh, we'd need a policy for that before we got to a policy for opening a section or closing a section or whatever. And so again, for us, just because of how big we are and how decentralized we are, and we are very decentralized still, although less so increasingly, the planning bit is easy. You will plan this way. Here's your historical data. Like here's how many, that part is like that. I can see how we centralize that easily. The registration stuff is going to be more, I think, more similar to assessment work, which is what I do, is getting people together and thinking kind of, here are best ways to do this. Here's how we're going to hold you accountable for doing what makes sense for your unit, right? Here's the parameters in which we would think you can play. And if you're ignoring it entirely, that's a problem. But that's then messier. It's harder.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think that Navigate, we implemented that a couple of years ago, and it and challenged, maybe I'll use the word challenged, some of our assumptions and our policies, our procedures. So Navigate's a tool, just like APS, CPO are tools. But I do think that it kind of requires us to dip our fingers down into our own processes and ask those hard questions, which then takes the rollout longer because we're fixing a lot of different things and not just introducing the tool. But Lou, I think that you're spot on with, what are the expectations? All right, here's the tool. The rich data coming out of here. Now, how are you going to use it? What do I expect you to do? What's the timeline? Registration starts on week 1. What does it look like on week 5? I want you in there looking at these things. By week 7, we need to be thinking about canceling low enrolled classes. Those kinds of things I think are really important to think through before you roll out and train people.
One of the things that came up in our small group was, I'm pre-associating here a little bit, the different roles that different folks on campus, or the different relationships that different folks on campus have. So Lou just mentioned that he's involved in accreditation, assessment kind of work, which is different than Karen's perspective. It's different than Karen's, co-lead's, Chris's perspective as the director of IR. And it was someone in my group whose name whom I'm forgetting was commenting that as an IE person, institutional effectiveness person, they have an ability to frame the use of data differently than someone coming particularly from the provost office or the VPA's office, where, and Karen alluded to at some point feeling like she was always carrying around a stick and bashing people for not having, full enough sections, having too many small sections. The IE office hasn't had to play that role, and so that's potentially a different framing and an opportunity to introduce CPO from a different with a different flavor. I don't know if there are other folks from IR or IE kind of offices who are thinking about what the right role for IR versus the VPAA's office or provost office to play. Sort of an open-ended question that folks can feel free to chat in on maybe.
This is Lisa Castellino from WVU. I can tell you from an IR perspective, there's a great opportunity that we have for synergy, because it's not only these type of data that we're talking about, it's other type of data that we can connect to help the organization and departments understand their academic portfolio as well as their labor force portfolio. So there's these two things that are kind of combining at the same time. There definitely is a difference between the person holding the stick to say you need to get your sections filled. My bigger question is to say, why aren't sections filling that way? What's happening in terms of curriculum portfolio? And this is where assessment and IR start to coalesce quite a bit. And then the next question is, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? And to be able to connect data from multiple sources and give a more comprehensive picture, not just from the technical standpoint of handing these data over, but to say, here's kind of what the history looks like. And for IR professionals, because we have access to data sometimes outside of our own house, we can bring in an outside perspective to say there may be a different way to think about this, for example.
Yeah, love that. I think that's a really nice, nice observation about different perspectives. Harrison, was there anything else from your group that you wanted to, that you thought was worth pulling out to the group, the larger group?
Yeah, I mean, and the only thing that I actually threw out didn't come up in the group. I actually threw it into the group from a partner who's not here, was unable to join us today. And thinking about, again, the other alternative perspectives, make sure you consider things like summer programs or online programs as you think about who might be able to use this. They interact obviously with the departments in a different way, but I think that I've seen some real interest from those groups and some of my other partners in actually getting access to this data. Actually came via the IR office because they were always asking IR for this type of information. But they could be another layer who I think could benefit from using or being exposed to what CPO has to offer. From one of the partners, when they actually saw it, they felt like they could serve as a role to actually help the chairs formulate what they should be offering over the summer by using this type of information that they thought really wasn't often optimized, where they actually had capacity constraints and could actually get the demand to justify offering it over the summer.
Yeah, and someone in my group, I think it was Gwendolyn, pointed out or observed that some programs don't have a lot of electives, or their students don't need to take a lot of electives because they have a regimented curriculum. But that means that you don't necessarily have as much sort of experience with what electives are going to be popular, are going to make. And so being able to use the data to look at sort of those electives and courses that you maybe don't pay as much attention to because they're not your gen ed courses or things like that, having the historical data enables you to say, okay, this actually is a course that has proven to be popular, and it makes sense to choose that this will be the elective we offer this term instead of that one.
I think it's great for gen ed for us, and I can't speak to other people. We have a enormous gen ed. So we end up with those, there's probably a small core of classes by use, essentially, right? That people use it. But then we have, quite literally several hundred other courses where we're always kind of like, do we really need X number of whatever area 4s of this fall? And it's kind of like, we're always like, meh, I don't know. So I'm really hopeful that in terms of centralizing gen ed, we can start saying, no, we don't. In fact, we know SCH is over the top. We know the seat production is over the top. In the moment, it is hard to do anything about it, right? And so it will help be like, oh, no, here's what we don't need this semester, right? Like we can actually do without a couple area 4s or whatever. So I'm hopeful that's one area we can definitely leverage this on both ends to do better, planning and registration status.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. All right, I am going to share my screen for one last slide and say, first and foremost, thank you for engaging with the conversation today. Really appreciate it. Please do feel invited to build out your communication and training plans and share them back with your strategic leader, have them give you feedback, ask them questions that you might have. That's what we're here for, and we're always delighted to have those conversations. And then, as Greg mentioned earlier, we've got a series of user-facing trainings coming up later this month and then across April. And I wanted to end about 5 minutes early. I think it'll be right on the mark here so that you can have a chance to both do this little poll here on your screens now, and then also you'll receive a slightly longer evaluation, not long, just slightly longer evaluation about the session and follow-up. Please do fill that out, provide your feedback. We read everyone, so feel free to leave us comments, and we really appreciate that feedback.